Well, good morning from the United States. I guess it's good afternoon in continental Europe. Welcome to this panel on e-mobility, where we're going to explore some of the promises and the challenges of e-mobility. But before we get started, I'd just like to say, while it's wonderful to appear in a digital platform that we found really excellent last fall, I have to admit that I missed the personal connections of gathering at an event that I found enjoyable and informative. And Paris isn't so bad either. And I really wish that I could be gathering with Russell and Alex and Lucy together, having a chat and then talking with you afterwards. But I really take a look at this panel and see it as sort of the half we missed of a conversation we had last fall, which is where we looked at sort of e-mobility, but more from the sort of mobility as a service side. And now we need to take a look at the other half of that equation. There needs to be energy for that e-mobility, and we want to kind of correct that. And this is the panel to do that, and then kind of marry it up at the end and see what that really means for the consumer. So I'd love the panel if they could introduce themselves. So we have Russell and Lucy and Alex. Lucy, why don't you kick us off? Say hi.
Thanks, Lance. So hi, everyone out there. Thanks for joining this session. I'm Lucy Yu. I run the Centre for Net Zero, which is an open research lab backed by Octopus Energy. And we are using data-driven modelling and simulation to investigate and find better pathways to decarbonisation around the world. Our first two areas, or first two sectors of interest, are decarbonising transport, and particularly roads transport, and decarbonising heat and buildings. So looking forward to the conversation.
Hey, thanks, Lucy. Russell, how about you?
Yeah, hi, thanks, Lance. Hi, everybody. Yeah, great to be here again. Well, Lance, I would love to be in Paris in person. It's raining where I am in the UK, so definitely doubly so there. So I work for National Grid in the UK, so we're the transmission system owner, so we own the high voltage wire, so the wires that take energy from the power stations. Traditionally would have been fossil fuels, but now increasingly renewables, particularly offshore wind, solar, nuclear, low carbon technologies, and we get that to where it needs to go. Increasingly, that needs to go into e-mobility, electric vehicles to start with, but also moving up other forms of transport. So my brief is to make sure that National Grid is part of that, and then make sure that the transmission and transport work together so we can get e-mobility and energy to work together. So really happy to be part of this panel. I say my remit is very broad, so I look at electric vehicles, also at other forms of transport, right the way up to aviation, even thinking about how we've got to create synthetic aviation fuel to get on there, but happy to keep it focused on to e-mobility and EVs today, but really looking forward to a good, lively conversation today.
Hey, thanks, Russell. One quick question. You work with the National Grid, which can sound like
yes.
It's publicly owned, but I believe it's a private company. Is that correct?
Yes. So yeah, great point to bring up, Lance. Yes. So we're a private company, but we are regulated. So we're a regulated monopoly in the UK. So for people that know Ofgem, they are our regulator. So they control our revenues, and they make sure that we abide by the law, all the rules and regulations that are out there, and making sure we're fair to all customers. Yes. So we're a utility, but we are privately owned, but we are kind of publicly regulated.
Awesome. But with a name like that, the National Grid, and we had to explore that just a bit.
Absolutely. Thank
you.
So,
Alex, I know you're not with the government. In fact, you're a colleague and friend in our Hogan Lovells' London office. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Thank you, Lance. Absolutely. So I'm an energy partner based in the London office of Hogan Lovells. I'm also the head of our power, renewables and energy transition subsector, which means that I try to help coordinate our growth into those markets. And as the name on the job title suggests, energy transition is a really big part of my focus and the work that I do. And within that, I've had a particularly keen focus on e-mobility and low carbon mobility for a number of years. So worked on a series of different projects across the kind of ecosystem, from deploying charge points in a variety of settings, looking at some of the government investment funds that have been launched in the UK as a means of catalysing investment into the sector and growth and so on. And also M&A as the sector begins to develop and to consolidate, buying into investments on behalf of clients who are looking to take a position in these markets. And That's been both on the passenger vehicle side, but also on the commercial vehicle side. And I'm happy to come on and touch on bits of that. It's also a household project for me. I'm married to a lady who has been head of policy at the UK's Office of Low Emission Vehicles, now zero emission vehicles, for the last 3.5 years, and now works in the energy systems catapult in the UK. So family focus for us on EVs and the transition to low carbon mobility. And we're just on the cusp. We're hoping this year to go full electric vehicle in terms of our own mobility needs. We're halfway there at the moment with one of our 2 cars, and we're just about to take the plunge and see if we can conquer range anxiety and access to charging and all the things we're going to come on and talk about now. Lance, back to you.
Well, Alex, if we could just improve your advocacy skills, maybe we could get your the other half of your family home onto a panel as well. So work on those advocacy skills a little bit for us, will you?
Sure thing. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think we should have her on a panel as well. And I understand that there's some connection between your significant other and Russell. So, we have a nice little conversation to be had when we're in person. But to get this thing going, I have to admit, I'm a car and a tech guy. So I grew up in rural America. I loved my car. And I liked computers early, and I could just assume that the energy was going to be there. The gas was going to be in my car pretty much whenever I wanted it, and the electricity was going to be there for the computers and the things that I was doing. But as we go to this vision of e-mobility, we shouldn't just assume that the energy is going to be there, right? We have to think about that sector as well. So I'd like to kind of structure this panel with, let's look at the...
But certainly in the first instance, getting to the point where all of the greenhouse gases that we're producing and emitting into the atmosphere, we're also balancing by those that we remove or we offset, hence the net in net zero. So from an energy industry point of view, this means a lot of things. In the simplest terms, it means decarbonising the power grid. And in fact, I was just talking about this earlier today. In the UK, we still do use fossil fuels to generate some of our electricity. So you can download the National Grid ESO app and have a look at the Great Britain generation mix, power generation mix. I had a look for yesterday, and about a third of our electricity was generated from gas. So I think in the simplest terms, this is about getting the power grid to the point that that energy, that electricity is all coming from renewable sources. Outside of the power or energy sector, it also means moving everything else away from depending on fossil fuels. So for this conversation, we're obviously talking about transport. That means moving vehicles away from petrol and diesel to greener sources of fuel. So not just electric vehicles, but electric vehicles that are using renewable electricity.
Cool, thanks, Lucy. Hey, Russell, let me refine the question a little bit for you. This goal of decarbonization and sustainability, is that something that the governments are driving? Are investors driving that? We hear a lot about ESG investing. Are consumers driving it? All of them. Can you give us some color on that while you explore how the National Grid sees this?
Absolutely. I think, like all good answer here, Lance, it's a combination of all of those, isn't it, as well? So certainly government will set the framework. Lucy mentioned net zero target in the UK. Now, certainly across Europe, there are many net zero targets of various different years. People even talking about going beyond net zero, kind of net negative is what people are talking about. There's a lot of competition there between kind of developed countries, G7 countries, to make sure that they've got the top target ahead of the COP conference later in the year as well. So you certainly see the government will set those frameworks, but I think you also see a lot of drive from consumers. So if you take electric vehicles, you do see the consumer drive there. People want electric vehicles. So once you experience electric vehicles, I'm sure Alex will say, so once you've driven an electric vehicle, suddenly you want both electric vehicles. Like him, we took electric vehicle, now we have 2 electric vehicles as well, because once you do that, you go back, and consumers will want that better experience. And also they'll start to realize, actually, this is about more than just saving the planet. This is about my local environment. This is about air quality, and this is about making sure my local environment is better as well. So there's definitely a consumer push there as well. And in the middle of that, that's where the investors need to get in. They need to say, where am I going to focus that in there? Where do I need to develop? What technologies do I need to get into as well? So it's absolutely a kind of tripartite myth there. But just build on a little bit what Lucy said there about the grid. Absolutely, we need to make sure it moves to 100% renewable. If I put my national grid hat, we would say low carbon as well, to make sure we call for all forms of technology there. Then it's making sure that energy can get to from where it's produced to where it's needed. Now, a lot of people know energy networks, especially in Western countries, in Europe and the US, they were developed around moving power from central fossil fuel plant out to where it was needed. Now we've almost got to reverse that model of lots of local generation, solar, wind, but also having some very large power stations, whether that's nuclear or whether that's offshore wind as well. These tend to be right on the edge of the network. So they tend to be where it's windy or it's wet or where people don't want to live for various reasons as well. So it's almost a reverse of what the grid needs to do. So it's about upgrading that grid infrastructure there so you can build in renewables as well. And with the variability you see of renewables, it's making sure that that grid is really resilient. And you've seen that various places around the world. So the way you do that absolutely is smart management, and EVs are going to be part of that. I'm sure we'll come on to that about how and when people charge the vehicle, but also about that interconnection. So if we talk across Europe, making sure that we can connect our grids together. So when it's windy in one part of Europe, then that energy can be used across it. If it's sunny in one part of Europe, can go across. Same for the US. If it's sunny in California, can you get that energy to, dare I say, Texas or to other parts of the US as well, where you could get that? So it's about making sure that grid is reliable for that future as more and more renewable energy comes on, but also on the other side of it, as more and more demand comes to electricity. We're talking about mobility here. We could be talking about heat. We could be talking about other areas that need to electrify as well. So that's definitely how we see the vision. So set by governments. That's where you need that really strong steer from kind of world leaders to set those net zero targets. And then a lot of the other bits will kind of come into place after that.
That's cool. Alex, I want to revise maybe the flow just a touch as we come to you. Russell mentioned that word demand. And that, as my background is in mathematical economics, of course, demand and supply are paired. So let's try and explore a couple of questions. First of all, just on the e-mobility side, EV sales are about 3% of the market right now globally. And so a tiny percentage of the overall fleet. But we're talking about trying to ramp up demand in the energy sector. Do we have a chicken and the egg issue? And then also I want to discuss, since we're talking about supply of energy and sustainability, how does we match sustainable with maybe the load that might go on the grid if we move EVs along? So Alex, could you give me a perspective on either the demand or supply question? Take whichever you like.
Well, let me start with demand, and I think it's one of the most interesting and most complex challenges that we face in terms of trying to grow this market towards zero carbon mobility, because we know where we are now, we know where we'd like to be, but actually the detail of how we're going to get there really is uncertain, and that's both the speed at which we're going to get there, which if you look at government projections will largely run ahead of what's actually happening in the market, but also the exact manner in which we're going to get there. So what that comes down to is a kind of, in the electric vehicles kind of space, is a charging hierarchy, which is trying to understand in different countries, in different parts of different countries, how are we going to charge over time? Are we going to charge predominantly at home, which is the view which is predominant in places where you have off-street parking? How much of our charging is going to be on the go? How much of it will be at particular destinations, whether that's shopping malls or hotels or on street? And so you get different sort of footprints in terms of what people need, and at different points in time, because as uptake of vehicles goes up, as battery ranges improve, the amount of charging and the patterns of charging are going to change. And that's only getting even more complicated when you then sort of cast an eye forward and you say, well, our driving habits are changing. We've gone from a sort of model where predominantly cars sit on the side of the road waiting to be used and are idle for 96 or so % of the time, to a ride-sharing model where those vehicles are active and behave in a different way, potentially to an autonomous vehicle scenario in which those vehicles will be like planes in the sky, trying to do as much mileage as they can. And the charging need and the solution in each of those cases is different. So what does that mean? I think in simple terms, it means you've got to try to solve for something you can understand now. And that probably means that business models are orientated towards the short term and towards what we can predict in the next few years and the life cycle of a charging infrastructure solution, with agility in order to be able to respond to how the market may or may not evolve to cater for this growth curve and the shift in patterns of behavior that we're going to see as charging becomes smart, automated, and perhaps taken out of our hands and just outsourced to autonomous vehicles that will do it all for us.
Cool. Then maybe let's go back to Russell for a little bit about the supply issue, and then to Lucy, how we connect that back to vehicles. So Russell, sustainable energy production. One reads a lot in the business press that, it's kind of lumpy. The wind or the sunshine only at periods of time that might not be well matched to demand. Can you talk with us about what that means for an energy provider and maybe how we map that ultimately to that e-mobility? What are the things that one has to think about?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So renewables or lumpy or variable, intermittent, there's all these words that you can use them as well. But simply when we look at it, it's a matter of demand and supply being kind of potentially out of alignment. So a lot of work of what we do and operators around the world do is their job is to make sure supply and demand for electricity are balanced on a second by second basis. That challenge will be the same going forward, whether it's now or 2030 or 2050. So when you look at that, you can think, okay, how can I manage that? So there's a lot you can do on the supply side. So what can you have in terms of dispatchability? So a lot of dispatchability, people traditionally see that as fossil fuel. Now we know they've got to reduce down, and the technologies that may produce them are maybe a little bit in their infancy as well. People will talk about CCS or nuclear, maybe a little bit variable as well. Not sure. So if we park those to one side, so let's then look at the demand side of the equation. So I have this variable, what can I do? So classically, in any other situation, we'd say, if I have an excess of supply, you'll know from your economics, can I store that and use that later? This is where the kind of world of batteries start to come in. We've seen a big demand for battery and storage technologies on grid, so grid level batteries. So there's that initial balance, let's try and balance that out. That works really well on a kind of relative short-term basis as well. If you're talking kind of longer term, so how can I maybe get from season to season if it's going to be windier in the winter than the summer there? Is there something I can do kind of more fundamental about my demand and how that's used? So that comes a little bit down to users. So is there something that we could see where user demand and user experience is something that we could put in here? And then this drops you into the e-mobility. Hang on a second, I have a car that I need to charge. When do I need to charge that? At the moment, I get home and plug it in, maybe charge it overnight, but there's no real thought about that. I don't need to do that. I go, oh, I need to charge it because it's got down to 50%. I might as well top it back up to 90% or whatever I need to do there. What if I had a system, an app, an automated system that say, I'm looking at the weather here. It's going to be a little bit windy tonight, so maybe you want to charge your car tonight, or look at it. Actually, it's maybe not going to be so windy. So if you can hold off, it'd be great. But I can see it's going to be windy tomorrow or the day after. And I don't think, based on your patterns of usage, I don't think you're going to get down to a point in your car where you really need to charge it. You're just charging it for habit because it's so easy to do, right? You just plug it in. It's like keeping your mobile phone. You keep your mobile phone topped up because, well, you never know. I could have to go somewhere, but rarely do you ever actually go somewhere you need it as well. So it's those kind of patterns there. And that's where you start to see a little bit of the technology and the digital side coming in as well. So there's a lot of information there I have to do. If I had to do that on my own, I would probably struggle a little bit. If there's a third party or an app or an automatic area that would do that, suddenly you've got this automatic intelligence that's starting to balance supply and demand there. And actually on the other side of this, you can actually see your renewables being slightly more optimized. So a classic engineering solution would be, let's say, if I've got a variable set of supply, do you know what, I'll just make a little bit more just to get me above those kind of risk periods. So I'll put more wind, or I'll put more solar, or I'll have more batteries on the system, or I'll have more backup generation to do that. But when you've got demand optimized, it actually makes it more efficient on the supply side as well. So you can help optimize your supply side by making sure your demand side is optimized well. And you get this kind of virtuous circle that starts to develop there. So that's very much how we can see it there. You can even go so far to actually, could vehicles go the other way, start to give power back into the grid? So vehicle to grid options as well. Could you start to
you're jumping
deliver that potentially as well? I know I had to get that in there, so I'll stop there and move in. But that's always the piece there as well. But that's always a good discussion piece for people.
It's going to be great. We're going to get there soon. I want to go back to Lucy for just 1 second. Lucy, you've had a lot of experience. You're researching issues. You worked with an e-scooter company. You've looked at autonomous vehicles and talked about safety. You really have that focus across the business spectrum, and also what do consumers want. So just to close out this section on the vision for the energy section, do consumers care whether the energy they're pulling off the grid is renewable or not, or is it just not a thing for them?
I think consumers are becoming increasingly aware, but I think you could pick almost any industry or any kind of application, and you would probably find that consumers value cost, convenience, and reliability, no matter what it is that you're talking about. I don't think those things are really fundamentally different when it comes to energy and charging of electric vehicles. I think, what I'm really interested in are what are the new possibilities for new businesses and new commercial models that can find a way to align all of those things. And so actually, what's the product or service that's optimized for carbon is also optimized for cost, and is also kind of optimized for that convenience and reliability. And firstly, I think the businesses that are able to find those products are the ones that are going to be the most successful over the next decade or two. But secondly, I also think that's going to be the key to really unlocking the whole of this transition, because if you can find something which is a great customer experience and low carbon, but it's still quite expensive, there will always be a segment of your customers who are very price sensitive. So I think really trying to find those opportunities that align all of those things is going to be the key to unlocking a lot of this change.
Lucy, thank you. I mean, I think the word that I'm coming away from is that one we often miss, and. So we have this vision of sustainability, but it needs to be something else too. It has to be sustainable and perform. So now I'm going to have to flip into car guy mode for just a second as we set up that, how do we make this EV thing work? So, last fall on a panel, and Lucy was on one of those panels, we talked about that vision that if we just took a vehicle-centric view of the world, it was ACES, autonomous, connected, electric, and shared. And my friend and colleague Patrick Ide and I have written about living mobility, where we've argued that ACES is too narrow. Just focuses on the vehicles. We should really focus on the consumers, and we need to blow those things up. So for our world, we look at sustainability, not just electrification. But when we get back down to the vehicle or the scooter that's going to get plugged into that grid, what makes that appealing? And we keep bumping into challenges, and I'm going to ask about the energy analog to that. One of them is the price. So how is the price of that battery going? What's that mean for the price of the vehicle? How convenient is it to charge? How long does it take to charge? What's the range of the vehicle? How dense is that network? And then does it work? Do people see it as reliable? Is it convenient? Those kind of issues. And those have all been seen as hurdles for EVs. But when people get in the EV, they love it. It's fast, it's quiet, they have more range than they think. It's just an awesome vehicle. If you're a motorhead and you want to go really fast, 0 to 60, an EV is your way to do it. I'd won a lot more drag racing, illegally with EVs when I was a kid than the 455 cubic inch engine that I had, right? We shouldn't really talk about my illegal behavior in racing cars as a youth, but you get the point. How do we make the energy sector match up so that consumers are less paranoid about e-mobility? So could you help me unpack what are those significant issues that have to be looked at to make that transition happen? And what's the energy sector's role in that? Alex, do you want to kind of start us off, frame it a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely, very happy to. And I think you've touched, Lance, in the framing of the question on a number of the issues that are right at the top of that agenda. I think range anxiety and price disparity at the moment are two of the biggest hurdles. I mean, if it costs you a lot more to buy the vehicle, you're already narrowing the marketplace. And you can make the argument that over the life of the vehicle, through not having to pay road taxes, through savings in fueling, that you get some of that back. You may get all of that back and a bit more. But for a consumer that's looking for a solution up front, that's a key challenge. Range anxiety is definitely an issue in the vehicle that we're looking to purchase at the moment. That has been the constant conversation. How many miles do we need to have in order to cover our worst case journey? How will access to rapid charging be able to support that? Will it be available? And I think consumers need to build confidence on that. I think ultimately that comes from the experience of having seen other people succeed with it, and so on. So those are definite barriers to people's thinking. And I think people need to have confidence in the life of the vehicle. They need to have confidence in the fact that the batteries will last beyond their warranty and give the car the equivalent kind of usage profile to a conventional ICE engine. And for me, one of the big kind of shifts that will help us with that will be when we see the lease sectors adopt EVs en masse for corporate vehicle and fleet vehicles, because in a sense, A lot of those structures are financed on the basis of secondary values of those vehicles at the end of their leased life. And that sort of maturity will both bring scale to the market, but it will also give data and confidence in the fact that these things have a sort of realizable value and a realizable life. And I think that's part of the pathway. I'll pause there.
Yeah, well, Alex, thank you. You kind of laid out a path for us to have this conversation. So we'll get to the transmission routes of fleets and the like, shared mobility. But let's just take a second and burrow in with Lucy and then Russell on, what's it going to take for the charging infrastructure to give those consumers that confidence. So take it wherever you want to go, Lucy. I know you thought and are researching on these issues.
Yeah, I think these are really interesting questions, and particularly the piece that was brought in about autonomy and what would autonomous fleets mean for where and when and how is charging happening.
Take us down that path if you'd like to.
Yeah, well, perhaps I will. It would be a bit of a rabbit hole, I think. But yeah, I mean, it is interesting the questions people pose around autonomous fleets. I've had a lot of conversations with people who have said, well, isn't it obvious that those fleets would be based somewhere on the outskirts of the city, because land is very cheap there and it's very abundant, and so these vehicles would provide a service during the day or during the busy hours, and they would return to the outskirts to charge at night. And it's an interesting view. I think it is just a view. I guess when I look at that sort of proposal, I think, well, land is cheap there and abundant there because traditionally people have priced land based on what you can develop on it or what you can grow on it. But I think probably a large part of that equation has, or that equation has not considered what kind of connection to the grid that land has had, and maybe that's been because it's been less historically important. We've had less electrification. We've not been using electric vehicles. We've not been using electricity for heating to the degree that we will need to in the future. So this idea about considering what's the size of the connection to the grid on that piece of land and what might it cost to upgrade to connect to the grid or to upgrade the grid hasn't maybe been such a large part of the consideration. I think that will change in future. So land that already has has a good connection to the grid, so there are low costs to consider, will become more sought after. And I'm told actually that if you do have a connection to the grid, if you buy a new connection to the grid, you have rights over it for I think 40 years in the UK. So I'm told. So that's a scarce resource, and if you can secure it, you secured it for a long time. So I wouldn't necessarily presuppose that autonomous fleets will all be on the outskirts of the city. I think what is interesting, and maybe thinking about my background from micromobility, as you sort of mentioned, I have previously worked at an e-scooter firm who I still actually work with on a more of an advisory basis now. That particular company has a very interesting model, which is a swappable battery model. Now, this means that those scooters don't need to return effectively to base or to a home. Fully charged batteries can be taken out to the scooters on the streets and swapped out in situ. And what that means is that the fleet has a very high availability, very high uptime for customers on the streets, and the charging is all managed in a very different way. Now that's easy to do for small vehicles with small batteries, but you could conceive a future in which you had some kind of roll-on, roll-off batteries for larger vehicles potentially. So I'm not really answering the question here. I'm just suggesting that I think maybe it's not as straightforward to answer as we might think.
That's all right, Lucy. I mean, for heaven's sakes, conversations have their own energy, and we're appearing digitally at a conference called Autonomy. So we had to throw in occasionally some references to AVs, and if not, they kick us off the platform. So Russell, let's go back to you for just a second.
Yeah.
When we're talking about building out that charging network to give customers, confidence, what's that going to look like, and who's going to do it? Is it a grid energy company like you, or is it subscription services through other entities? What's your vision of how that might roll out?
I think so. I will make one further point on the autonomy, just because it's good to get to. Yes, certainly from an operational point of view, that world that Lucy described, there are people back on National Grid that get very excited about this because they see banks of vehicles sitting there charging, and they see that the flexibility that offers in terms of balancing the grid, what we talked about earlier, balancing that wind and that solar as well. They get very excited about that. Whether that becomes a reality, I'm not sure, but there's lots of engineers and lots of power systems managers that are very interested in that potential world. But back to charging there, I think you see this as, the way we look at it, there's a balance on charging, isn't there? There is home charging, and if you're lucky enough to be able to have an EV and you're lucky enough to charge it at home, that's going to be your go-to for 90% of what you need to do as well. And then there's the other extreme of this, say, I'm going on that long journey. Alex mentioned about, well, can I work out for that longest journey to do? There will be a journey that you need to do that will be outside the range of even the top range of EV that you could buy at the moment. You get that with a petrol or diesel car at the moment. I can't drive right up in the UK. I couldn't drive from where I am to Scotland. You can drive across Europe. You can drive from New York to Los Angeles without having to refuel a petrol car. So people accept that, yeah, you're going to have to do that. So it's what that infrastructure looks like, and that's the kind of the bit that we're interested in. So this is suddenly not in our world of smart. This is turn up. This is need energy now. And I may be able to turn it up with lots of other people. So you think about kind of classic holiday. Everyone goes out. Everyone goes on the major roads, and everyone comes off at their service station or their rest stop and say, I want to charge up my electric vehicle. I want to have a coffee, a snack, or whatever you need to do when you stop off there. So that's a lot of cars that need rapid charging, and they all need rapid charging at once. You can't ask someone to say, would you mind rapid charging at night, because that helps balance the grid. So that's a significant part of the infrastructure that you need to get into. And then you're onto the side of, these places tend to be quite rural, because rest stops are halfway between two places you want to be. So there's not a lot of infrastructure there. So you need to get significant amounts of infrastructure in there to get significant amount of charges in there. And that's what's interesting from our point of view, say, can we harness the energy infrastructure, which kind of runs quite close to this. If you ever drive along a road, you'll generally see pylons or wires go alongside it, because planning people out there, infrastructure corridors are built, and you tend to put all the infrastructure in there to reduce dig up lines and bits and pieces there. So you can actually tap off the existing system and then get that energy to you. I think it's really important that you get that there at pace, because it does two things. It gives people confidence. So when they drive in their petrol car, they say, oh, I see there's rapid chargers there. Oh, I know that, because if I did this journey in an electric car, I would be able to stop. And then there's a continuity point as well. Say, I can see that there. Then I drive to the next one, and I see that there as well. I go, okay, that's how I get to that. Oh, it's just like a petrol station. I just go in, I just put contactless card in there, and they go along. So you've got a confidence and continuity there that gets people into electric vehicles. But you need that. We talked about chicken and egg earlier. You kind of almost need that infrastructure ahead of need, or at least at the same time as well. You can't have uptake of EV without having that, because that range anxiety does need to be overcome. So we certainly think having a rapid charging network is kind of essential. And you can see that there are some car companies, I don't know if we now to mention names, that have worked out this and have taken themselves to kind of build a rapid charging network off their own back. And you almost now need a public rapid charging network to be able to get that full uptake of electric vehicles. And that's where we're very interested from a transmission network point of view.
Got it. Russell and Alex and Lucy, we're getting some questions that really ask, is this something that one company can do? Do a lot of companies have to work together? I might add, does government have to fund this to get the infrastructure there? What does that look like to get from, you can put out a lot of information to say EVs are great, and really you don't need as much range as you think you do. And in those exceptional moments when you take a long trip, it's going to be there. But there's also a sense of who provides those solutions to give that confidence. Alex, can you give us a window onto those questions?
Yes, I've got two thoughts to share on those. I think one is interoperability, and we haven't touched on that yet. But clearly, if we end up in a world where different solution providers have different charging cables, and you have a sort of VHS Betamax type issue, that complicates the ability of individual users being able to access multiple charge points and the nearest charge point that's available to them. So ultimately, although the individual developers may not want to see this future, I think we need to head to a world in which charge points are interoperable, and the user interface in order to access them is also interoperable. So at the moment, if you're a EV owner, you'll have multiple apps on your phone in order to access charge points, each with different deals, subscription or pay as you go or something else, but you don't have a single interface. That complicates the pathway towards dealing with confidence and range anxiety and so on. The other thing I'd say just on the second point is I think it's about the lived experience. I think you can put out as much propaganda or information as you like. The thing that we've seen make the difference is as soon as somebody in your friendship group gets an EV and it's seen to work, other people get interested in it. We've certainly been a catalyst at our school gate for getting people to adopt electric vehicles, partly because we're out there lobbying every morning, telling people to turn off their diesel engines while we wait and so on. But I think there is something to be said for seeing it in action. And if you get positive reports about the user experience from owners, that creates confidence and that mushrooms out from there.
You know, any good conversation goes by fast. And the sad news is we've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. And so I want to touch briefly, at least, on this last topic of, what's the future when we start merging that energy world and that vehicle world. And so I hear lots of things, Lucy, about like V2G and V2X. So Lucy, Russell, Alex, maybe 1 minute each on what's that future? What's that interaction? Lucy, could you start us off?
Yeah, that's good. It's quite a hard question to answer.
Oh, it's easy. 1 minute, not a problem, right?
Yeah.
A massive topic about the future.
Yes, I mean, certainly a future in which, we as individuals and households have much more participation in this system generally. So we touched on things like V2G, V2X.
What's the difference between G and X in that situation?
G is grid specifically, X is infrastructure. So I suppose, X is everything actually, but so you could imagine that being a local building, for instance. So maybe rather than that energy going back to the grid and then to the building, it's just a direct, it's some kind of direct transfer. I think more individual household level participation in this system. I would say also interoperability, the point that Alex made, I think will become more of a big deal. I remember when I first had a debit card, trying to find an ATM that was from your particular bank in order to be able to use that card. 20 years later or whatever, I think ATMs might not be around for very much longer. So that really shows how much has changed. But I think also some real thinking about how we can compensate people fairly for their participation in this new kind of system, a much more distributed and decentralized system, but actually making sure that the way people participate, they kind of receive fair compensation for that.
Cool. Hey, Russell, can you help us with that? I mean, what is the National Grid thinking about that kind of interaction with its consumers?
Absolutely. I think you see that vision. You see people were coming from the model where people were passive, they took energy off the system, to kind of active participants, whether that's through their vehicle or for their solar panels or for their heating or whatever it's going to be in the future as well. So, and the question is how they do that, and it's going to be digital, right, as well. You're not going to get people to actively kind of interact with the grid or talk to people in control rooms and say, oh, I think I'm going to pop out a bit later, is that okay? So it's just what that system looks like. So you're going to have the digital system there. So suddenly everyone is going to kind of active energy consumer rather than a passive energy consumer. And you've got to see that move out to mobility. So mobility and energy and digital are all going to kind of merge into one. So everyone at the moment has kind of defined kind of job titles as well. You've got to see people where that's kind of goes in together. I start to look at that, and I see transport and energy kind of come in together. So rather than seeing these as separate things, you've got to have these as kind of one solution that's ultimately going to get you to this kind of net zero goal that we started off talking about. But yeah, people will be involved in there, and there will be lots of innovative companies that will help as an aggregator and help you do that as well. And that, I think, the final point there is you've got to make sure that the regulation keeps up with that, so that transition does become fair and people are fairly rewarded for the risks and the benefits that they take off the system. So that's a whole nother debate about the future of regulation, I'm sure.
Well, our friends at Autonomy give us the digital yank at a very precise moment. I mean, it's like nuclear engineering. When the second hand hits the hour, we're done. So I want to thank you all for a panel that I found very interesting. I learned. I'd like to continue the conversation and really kind of think about how those two sectors, e-mobility and energy as a service, really merge, because that's going to define our future. So thank you all.